Good morning, everybody. Welcome to grade school. Super excited to see everyone on this Friday morning. Always glad to be back with you guys. I've been, as usual, holed up in my color cave and working with clients, but it's mostly over Zoom. So I'm glad to have a little bit of company and a little bit more casual company than like, oh my God, we got to get this done. We got to, grade this shot that way and that shot that way. Good to take a break and be hanging out with you guys. Hope everyone's having an awesome week. We're going to do some kind of freestyle stuff today. I don't have a big agenda, so get in there with your questions. I'm going to try to hit as many of them as I possibly can today. And really the only thing that I want to talk about before we dive into those, and of course, before I start doing my thing, I'll mention that I'm joined today by Raphael, who's going to be helping me get everybody's questions answered. So thanks to him for being here with us. And we're excited to dive into this stuff. So I want to follow up before we start hitting questions with what we were talking about last week regarding grain, and specifically about how we might go about routing grain into like prioritizing it to fall more into the midtones, shadows, or highlights, because there's a couple things that I think I can clarify and also add on to that conversation that I didn't touch on the other day. So let's start with kind of rebuilding what I was doing last week. So this would be my normal way of creating grain inside of a grade, whether that's at the shot level or at a group post clip or a timeline level or whatever. I'm just going to do this here on the clip. And actually, let me undo this layer mixer here so that I don't like it to Y off from that initial goalpost on the left there. Just weird personal taste. So I'm going to do a layer mixer here, and here's how we're going to set it up. I am going to grab an instance of the film grain built into Resolve here, and I'll pick out a gauge and some settings that I like. Usually like a 35 millimeter at the stock setting is pretty good. And what I'm going to do here so that we can exert a little bit more control is set this card to grain only. And in this way, I'm just looking at the card, obviously. I'm not looking at any underlying image at all. And what I'm going to do now is right-click on the layer mixer here and set the composite mode to overlay. So those two steps in tandem is basically giving me what I would have had without doing the layer mixer or the grain only thing inside of the OpenFX. So far it hasn't done me much good, but it allows me to do a couple things. I can do some blurring on this bottom layer, and just so everybody remembers, it's always a little counterintuitive and always very easy to forget that layers are upside down in Resolve. So this visually top layer is actually taking the lowest priority in the layer mixer, and this visually lower layer, node number 3, is actually taking the highest or the top priority in Resolve's layer mixer. And if it really confuses you, you can always flip those things upside down. But just remember that if you ever go in and clean up your node graph, like I do often, they will flip back the other way again. So I've got this kind of basic setup done. And what I'll typically do up here is do a little bit of softening with some blur or maybe even midtone detail if I feel like being really sneaky. And this is all stuff we kind of touched on last week, but just want to recap it. And I'm talking just a little bit on that blurring, like just a couple little degrees of it is all you really need. And now I want to talk about what we can do to prioritize. Like, I'm going to leave this amount of grain that I have here just so it's easy for us to see. And I want to talk about what I could do from here if I wanted, for example, to flag off this grain and have it be limited exclusively to like the middle and upper tonal regions of the image and really not hit the shadows at all. So we were playing around with this last week and I was kind of freestyling, but I think actually the simplest solution here would be the qualifier, which, as you guys know, I don't often reach for as a first resort, but I think it's probably the right thing here. You could also build your own kind of like alpha mask or matte if you wanted to, but I think this is probably the easiest way to go about that. So the way I would do this is prepend a node from my grain layer here, and I'm going to go into my qualifier, and because all I want to do is affect the luminance of the tonal region that that the grain is affecting, I don't need to worry about hue or sat, so I could either turn those off, leave them where they're at, or I could even go to loom here if I wanted them to kind of flip off for me. And then I'm going to go to my highlight mode, which I can do with Shift H, or I can hit my little magic wand up here. And I'm just going to start to choke in my low point until I feel like I'm flagging off the lower tonal values that I don't want to receive that grain adjustment. And right now I've got a hard edge, like zero softness on it. So what I'm going to do from this point, this is the most important thing when you're doing something like this with the qualifier, go super, super soft. There's no need for it to be tight. It's not like you're trying to really surgically slot into a specific tonal region for any purpose. So go really, really soft to make sure that no one's ever going to be able to see the edge between grain and not grain, if that makes sense. We really want there to be a mellow feather between those things, because the whole premise of what we're talking about is a soft prioritization of yes up in the highlights and no, not nearly as much down in the shadows, but like there's no benefit to making a really hard precise edge there. All you're going to do is have the potential for strangeness. Like, you know, actually this is a great example. Before I soften things out, let's just have a look and see how we're feeling. So right now I've got a qualifier pulled, but this qualifier, if I flip it on and off, it's not doing anything to my image yet, right? So what I want to do from here is take the alpha output of this qualifier that I've made and pipe it into the alpha input of my grain layer. And when I do that, you're going to see the grain in the lower regions get affected. And you'll also see exactly what I was talking about. If I like zoom in here, I'm going to go crazy far because I'm sure this isn't great over the YouTube. And if give me one second here. There we go. So you guys can see what I'm talking about. Like, oh, great, really hard edge. Opposite of what we want. So the way we're going to ensure against that is we're going to go back to this qualifier and go super, super soft with it. Just make it a really mellow transition. And I'm going to zoom back out and just have a look at what my key is looking like. In situations like this where you are qualifying on a log state of the image and you're working like I am in a manual node-based color management setup, you can also just flip to like your high con matte, I think they call it in Resolve. I actually want to see what the term is. I guess they just call it the black and white mode. Or no, this is... What's the one that I'm actually... no, this is the one I'm looking for. So you can get a better sense here in pure black and white in terms of like where you are qualifying things. So anything that is white is going to be like fully transparent and where grain is going to hit hardest. Anything that's gray is going to be somewhere in between. And anything that's actually pure black is going to allow no grain to pass through whatsoever. So you can see by the time we get into like our subject's hair here, there's effectively almost no grain going to be admitted onto that area, which we can see when we look at that map. So that would be my kind of simplified approach to exerting full control over the tonal regions there. And I also want to point out a very simple alternative that Jim was kind enough to point out after last week's session, that let's say you didn't want to do this blurring and you don't really care about getting super specific and seeing the matte and seeing where you're pumping grain in and out. If I just reset everything and do an instance of the film grain node here, like I said, this is effectively the same thing as I created with the layer mixer when I do it like this. And if I wanted just within this 1.0 effects with no layer mixer, no keyers, no fanciness, I could affect which of these regions are receiving grain versus not by adjusting this here. So, and actually, I now want to check something. Okay, good. Just making sure that that's not doing some kind of color correction to the grain card. It's doing what I thought, which is, okay, how much of this grain is going into the shadows versus the midtones versus the highlights. So you can kind of like prioritize things here if you wanted to, for example, hit the highlights hard and not hit the midtones or the shadows at all. You could do something like this. And the only caveat here is that highlights, midtones, and shadows are dependent on our tone curve. And it appears to me when I look at this that the highlights range that is being designated under the hood of this tool is a little too high for a log image. So you might have to just play with it until you got an acceptable result. But that would be a really viable alternative if you wanted to keep it dirt simple and just kind of like feel your way to a good result. No layer mixers or qualifiers necessary, and you could do it all inside of the film grain tool here. So good conversation to kind of round out the close of our last session together. And I'm ready to go, man. Hit me with your questions. What do we got out there, Raphael?
We got two questions regarding grain as well. One is from Raf B and another one is from Hamilar Design. The first one from Raf Why would grain be sharper than the image printed on it? Kind of mysterious to me, because grain is on the same layers that the image get printed on. And the other question is, why don't you want grain in the shadows?
Yes, two really good questions. So, regarding the first one, like what's the concept or what's the idea behind grain being sharper than the underlying image? It's a slippery concept. Like you're right, that it's not that they don't actually exist as separate things when we're talking about like the grain you get out of a film negative or a film print or both. Like the grain is the inherent structure of the image. Like that if a digital image is made up of pixels, grain represents like the noise or the individual components of the discernible individual components of a film negative or a film positive. So the idea of softening things underneath there is that you're never going to have anything that is as resolute as the grain, because the grain represents the ceiling of the resolving power of that particular format, if that makes sense. So it's a question of like a little nudge like I'm doing here that to my eye just seems to integrate the two pieces a bit better. And this, I'm sure, is not going to be super perceptible over the YouTube feed here. But, like I would categorize this more as a creative, like sort of analytical observation as opposed to something that is measured and proven mathematically. It just appears to me when I look at a film image, I'm seeing a combination of like, oh, the grain has like a nice like sharpness and resolution to it, and it has kind of like a tacky quality to it. But if I look at the underlying image, there's a little bit of a softness to it. Now, why exactly that is, like you probably could be more scientific than I'm being when I say image should be just slightly softer than the grain is. But that's my observation, is that we're just a hair softer underneath that most resolved, sharpest aspect of the image that actually represents the individual components of it. So hope that makes sense, or at least gives you something to think about and try on. Like you should play with it and see like maybe you like it better not doing anything underneath. The color grading police certainly won't come and arrest you for that. And then regarding the second question of like why might you want to do grain only in the highlights or only in the shadows, a whole variety of reasons, ranging from like a pure aesthetic thing of like I just like how it looks doing that in the top versus in the bottom, or maybe you're trying to match to something. Like maybe you have a piece of Alexa footage that you're dropping into a timeline of 35 millimeter material, and your observation from looking at the 35 mil stuff is that the grain is more perceptible in the top than in the bottom, or vice versa, and you're simply trying to match that sort of overall distribution. So all kinds of different cases why you might want to distribute the grain or prioritize its appearance to the bottom or to the middle or to the top of the image. It just depends on your eye and the workflow that you're using.
All right, this question is from ADOC. Where would you place the grain, at the beginning or at the end of the grade?
Yeah, good question. We actually talked about this in another episode of Grade School, but I think like if we wanted to answer it in a sort of like geeky, detail-oriented way, a good way to answer it would be to say like, well, am I trying to model print or negative grain? If it was going to be negative grain, I might choose to do it at the head of the image. If it's going to be positive, then I might want to do it, or print grain, I should say, I would do it at the end. And if we think about it like from a slightly different perspective of like, okay, that's a cute like sort of theory that you have there, but let's think about it this way. Like, let me just quickly build a pipeline similar to something that I might actually do. I'm going to do the new colloid print tool, which I'm super pumped about. And let's try out both options. So I'm just going to really quickly model out like, here's a pretty common node tree for me. I'm going to do exposure, I'm going to do printer points, and I'm going to do my custom contrast piece here. And so the question would become, in this workflow, would I prefer my grain to go here? Or would I prefer my grain to go here on node number 1? Well, the immediate question would be like, well, what the hell's the difference? Like, if I just grab a grain, and again, like grain is tough to talk about over YouTube, but we're going to do our best here. So if I grab a grain and, exaggerate it so it's hopefully pretty easy for you guys to see, I'm never going to do it downstream of my look layer or my print stock, like that's a given for me because I'm not going to do anything underneath my print stock because the whole point of the print stock is everything goes underneath it. Or I misspoke. I'm not going to do anything above my print stock because the entire point of it is that everything goes underneath it. So if it's a question of this versus that, if I wipe between those, there's no difference whatsoever. Like it's identical. So in one sense, like the question would be like, what does it matter? But like if we think about it, once I start getting into grading, and let's say in this shot, I decided that I wanted to pull a stop from this image, like so. Now, if I look at downstream versus upstream grain in the context of, say, a simple exposure shift, I am going to get slightly different results, actually very slightly different results. And maybe if I like stretched contrast or did my balance, like think about it this way, like you can think about adding the grain upstream as like cooking it into the negative in the same way that like you might have resident grain in your film negative. And that means that, well, when maybe I went the wrong direction here with my exposure. Maybe the easier thing to demo would be like, well, if you have added grain and then you stretch your exposure, you're probably going to exacerbate that and get even more noise when you have added it upstream than if you add it downstream after having made whatever exposure adjustments you're going to make. I mean, let's just have a look. Yeah, so you guys can see, probably not going to be able to see on the image itself very well, but you can see in my scopes, like that's making a difference. So it's a lot, that's kind of the fundamental question is like, what are you trying to model? And maybe more practically, it's like, do I want my shot level grade to start from a position of having some grain and some noise in it that's going to like change the way my adjustments look and feel? Or do I want my grain to be a consistent factor that always feels the same that's happening after I dial in my shot level look? That's kind of how I would think about that stuff.
Okay, we got another question regarding film print emulation from Naveen Chandran. How would you go about making the colors go deeper like a film print?
Very good question. Lots of different ways to go about that. My go-to method is to step outside of the RGB color model and use a model which has a sort of limit on the maximum ceiling. So I'm going to show you guys the colloid saturation tool. This is just a new version of a tool that's been around for a while. And all that's going on under the hood here, I've got this color density slider here. All that's going on under the hood is I am trading what we could think of as additive or video saturation for subtractive saturation, and in doing so, increasing the density. So if I let's just add some color, and now you can see as I pump this density slider, let's go to something even a little more colorful, like my Isabella here, just to make it a little more obvious. So you guys can see as I pump that density slider and I look at like her face and my patches, I've got, things are getting heavier in the more saturated colors, like so. So that, to give you a cheeky answer, I would go about it with, like in my workflows with a tool like this, but you could also use something like an HSV color model to do it. Like the sort of simple version of what I just did is if you are in a good color management environment and you've got your things tagged properly up here, you could right click and go color space, HSV, and then think about it this way. If we switch from RGB to HSV, R, G, and B become H, S, and V. So if I gain what Resolve is calling my green channel, I'm gaining my S channel, which in an HSV model is going to give me more density because there's a maximum that gets set at the point that we convert to HSV, above which the overall signal level won't be allowed to reach beyond. So it's a way of adding color, but without increasing the overall level of the image. So if I were to just go in and do some green gain, like so, similar result to what we were just seeing with that colloid tool there. So that would be kind of like the go-to method. And there's a crazy different number of saturation models and schemes out there the canned one that we have inside of Resolve is neither good nor bad, but it only represents one particular algorithm or approach to adding color into an image. And there's lots more out there that just use different math and different concepts and apply them in different ways. So saturation is a fascinating topic to think about and explore, but that would be a good place to start, is starting to look at different color models, and in particular for subtractive feeling stuff that is not going to increase in overall luminance. The S channel of something like an HSV color model is going to be a good place to begin.
Okay, another question from Ruthu Joshi this time. Can you speak about the role of chromatic aberration in color grading or some usage at all?
Yeah, so, the role of chromatic adaptation, that was the question, right?
I guess so. I guess so. It
Okay.
says aberration, but probably is what
Oh,
you
maybe,
said.
or maybe it is aberration. Chromatic aberration. I mean, the only context I'm super familiar with that term in is in terms of the behavior of a lens, and specifically the things that happen at the edges of lenses where a color doesn't resolve properly. It doesn't reproduce as the color that was presented to the lens, or you get like a misalignment of your channels so that you're not seeing red, green, and blue kind of stacking on top of each other. Those are the things that I tend to like. That's what I think of when I hear the term chromatic aberration, and that's an interesting thing to bring up. To be honest, that's not something I've ever personally played around with modeling in a post-production environment, as opposed to a characteristic that you would observe and select for in a piece of glass. I suppose you could contemplate the idea of modeling that in a post-production system, but that's not something that I've done before. Interesting idea, though.
Okay. Another question from Naveen Chandran. How would you emulate the effect of diffusion like that of promised?
Yeah, so that would be a question of some combination of like a blur or a softening of some sort, and then just figuring out where in the image that belongs, because it's probably not going to be a blanket thing. So like, and candidly, I haven't made a recent study of that particular filter. I have a general idea of what it does, but if I wanted to go about modeling it, I would, in an ideal scenario, try to get some really controlled test material so that I could look at, okay, which colors and which tonal regions does this filter seem to affect, and in what way, so that I could make as meaningful of a recreation of it as possible. But it's probably going to be some combination of using a texture operation, which you could do in Resolve with your midtone detail. You could use your blur if you wanted to go a little more aggressive with it. Let me turn that back on. Like so. You go away. And you go back on. So we could do something like that. We could also play around with this texture pop tool, which we've talked about before. It's pretty cool. It's kind of an answer to Resolve's texture equalizer, or to Baselight's texture equalizer, I should say. In this mode, it's basically just midtone detail. But if I were to, let me go full on the strength here. Yeah, so when we're in this simple operating mode, it's basically just midtone detail. But if I switch it to advanced, I end up with these kind of ranges where I can really dial in like, okay, for my small details, do I want those to go softer or sharper? And this would be a pretty good, if I had to do it in one tool as simply as possible in terms of that Pro Mist recreation thing, you could go quite a ways just by kind of like fussing and finessing these different tonal regions like so. But what I would probably find myself doing is getting like, okay, let's get an overall like, when the Pro Mist does soften the image, when it does add diffusion, what does that look like? That would be question number one for me. How soft is it? Does it have any kind of a color bias to it? What is the character of that softening when it occurs? And then from there, I would ask the question, where does it occur? Does it occur in particular luminance ranges? Does it occur in particular luminance ranges, only in particular sections of the color wheel, like how narrow and focused is it? And then I would seek to like recreate that aspect of it as well. I could kind of use a similar method to what we talked about with grain at the beginning of today's session, where I could take, like, let's just say that this setting that I've done for my texture pop, let me go a little more aggressive with it so it's a bit easier to see. I'm just going to go good and soft on, like, you know, something like that, where we're like, okay, we're doing...
Maybe it is working now?
I think we might be back. I think. Man, I hope we're back.
Yeah.
What am I doing
We're
wrong,
back.
man? I think, like, God is sending me a sign here that like 2 weeks in a row. It's stupid technical issues. All right. I'm going to assume that we are back in business for now. Okay, so we were talking about recreating a ProMist type of diffusion in post-production. And we've talked about doing that in 2 steps. Step 1 being when the diffusion does occur, what does it look like? What is its character? And trying to recreate that as best we can. And then from there, figuring out where does it occur? Where in the image, where in what color areas, what tonal regions does it occur? And we had just started to talk about taking a similar approach to selectively pumping it into the correct areas by using a similar scheme to what we had with our grain strategy that we talked about earlier today. So if we were to do a node upstream of this layer mixer that I've built, where I am combining these 2 pieces, and in this case I have not changed my compositing mode, I'm just in normal, and let's say, for example, that I wanted to limit this to the upper end of the image, kind of like we did before. I'm just going to put this around a 65. Now let's go to like 60. Yeah. And then we can soften things out like we've talked about. And then from here, I'm just going to pipe this alpha output into the alpha input. And I should now be seeing, if I zoom in and kind of look at these details, we can see that little shift. It's not, I think it's too nuanced of an adjustment. Let's just go crazy with our strength for a second here. Yeah, so you guys can see now I am affecting, here's my highlighted region. So now I'm making the adjustment, the textural adjustment that I talked about, that we dialed in a moment ago, but we're only doing it in the qualified region of the image. So not particularly fired up about what I'm looking at quite yet, but that would be how I'd go about that. What's the character of the diffusion? What is it doing? And then going from there and saying, okay, where does that take place? And making a study of that, and then doing your best to recreate it inside of Resolve.
All right. Easy Sonka wants to know how to work with graphics created in Photoshop or Illustrator inside DaVinci Resolve, and how to manage the colors of those graphics.
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's a complex question potentially, because if we're talking about delivering for anything other than SDR, like if it's just an SDR deliverable, let's talk about that simple version first. If you are just doing an SDR grade, and because you've been watching my videos and hanging out in grade school and getting hip to, like, I'm going to color manage and I'm going to work in a high dynamic range working color space with lots of color volume, and I'm going to start thinking about everything in a scene referred rather than a display referred context, if ultimately you're just going at 7 or 9 and that's your only deliverable, probably the easiest thing is actually just to, like, as long as I don't do this, actually even if I do it at the timeline level, everything that's going to be happening in my, actually no, I take that back. I do need to, basically, if I'm managing in nodes, I need to not color manage at the timeline level, or I simply need to use color management in my project settings. But as long as I'm doing one of those things and I'm not doing any of my color management at the timeline level of my node graph, as far as the edit is concerned, where we would be placing things like graphics, all that Resolve sees at the edit stage here is the final normalized Rec. 709 image. So if I bring in graphics that are also normalized for Rec 709, then I'm good to go. I don't actually need to do anything else. It's only when I want to grade or modify those graphics, or even more so when I have like a really common thing that comes up a lot is, okay, the motion graphics person has just given me a whole bundle of assets that need to go into the show, but they were all generated in like an sRGB or a Rec 709, just an SDR delivery space. And if I'm delivering HDR, I drop those things into my timeline and they absolutely burn my retinas because they're not set up to occupy a high dynamic range container, but rather a standard dynamic range one. So in that case, we basically have two options. You can go back to the graphics vendor, or if you are the graphics vendor, the cleanest solution is simply to generate those assets in a simpatico color space. So like if I'm working in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate or like ACES CCT, whatever my working color space is, the ideal would be to work with your graphics vendor or generate your own graphics right into that working color space. So rather than we might historically have done of targeting your Rec 709 SDR display space, the graphics are actually created for that working color space, and then you will down map them as part of your color management, as part of your like online or your finish. That would be one option. The other option that's really common, because a lot of graphics folks and a lot of graphics tools are really not well versed with HDR and color management and all those kind of things. The other option would be to input map those sources. So if I had, let's see here, do I have an SDR? I don't really have an SDR piece of material handy, but I would put it this way. If I'm color managing, if I'm working in a scene referred color managed environment, like I always encourage you guys to do, and I get some graphics that are being integrated into my timeline and I need them to marry well inside of it, I would just map them like any other source and draw the reasonable conclusion that this is probably Rec 709 SDR or like sRGB, some kind of like like SDR display space spec that this graphic exists in. So what I need to do on the grade for those graphics is input map them into my working color space, whatever that may be. Basically just treat it like it's a piece of Rec 709 or sRGB source and map it into your working color space. That way, when it receives the output transform that is hitting all of the shots in your timeline, that output transform is hitting an asset that is in the proper color space and tone curve, as opposed to hitting like, if I were to pull in a Rec 709 graphic right now and drop it into my timeline, it would look nuts because it's going to receive this creative transform, which is not designed for a Rec 709 state of image. It's designed for a Arilog C state of image. And then it's going to receive this transformation, which is also not designed for a Rec 709 state of image. It's designed for an Alexa state of image. So it's a question of figuring out a way to feed the pipeline that I've built what it is expecting to see, but essentially just input mapping the way you would any other source. Hope that's helpful.
Depender wants to know how to copy and paste grades on long form projects.
Yeah, really good question. So the you know, with long form stuff, the name of the game in general is like this is where it pays to keep it simple because you're working with a basic node graph. But like there's lots of different ways we could go about that. If you're talking about like there's the color trace feature, if anyone's ever used that, if you're like pasting, you know, like a reconformed timeline, you've reconformed something and you need to track grades you've already done. But just in general, in terms of like moving through a grade at speed and you're like, all right, that's going to take that grade, that's going to take that grade. There's all kinds of tools and functions that exist to support and automate that for you. I'll say for me, most of the time, I'm just middle clicking. Like if I land on shot 7 and I say, hey, this is almost identical, like if we do a kind of contextual thing, if this was my grade on shot 9 and I land on shot 13 and I'm like, hey, this is probably going to receive a similar or identical treatment to what I did on shot 9, I could just middle click shot 9 and track it. Like I'm sure you guys are all hip to that, but that's what I'm doing most of the time is just middle clicking 1 or 2 or 10 shots prior, however far back they go. If it's a more extreme case where I'm like, oh, that shot from 100 shots ago is what I want, I'll just pop up the light box and find it and middle click it like that. And then the only other thing I would add to that is another really common thing when we're grading, particularly narrative, where it's like, okay, we're grading a conversation in a restaurant and we've got singles and overs that are going to be maybe peppered in with a wide shot or two here. The plus and minus keys inside of Resolve, respectively, are going to paste from one shot back versus 2 shots back. So I could, if I'm on shot 8 and I want to paste shot 7, I can just hit my plus key. If I want to paste shot 6, I can hit my minus key. So that's the other kind of go-to one that I use a lot anytime there's a predictable rhythm of like, all right, we're going to cut to his face, then we're going to cut to her face. And then guess what? We're going to cut back to his face and then back to her face and so on and so forth. I'll use that plus and minus a lot to apply grade from one shot back or 2 shots back, just as a quick kind of shorthand thing for quickly applying the same grades across different shots.
All right. Jen Chengun wants to know what are some of your go-to / personal favorites / more common film print emulations and negative stocks?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I'll share this with you guys. I am trying to wean myself off of a dependency on traditional film emulation. I think it's problematic. There's this sort of like tension in the history of motion imaging in that, like, if we look at the majority of the really quality, really good R&D that has been done on what makes motion images look awesome, specifically for like cinematic distribution for theatrical, like transport the viewer into another emotional space. Most of that stuff was done by film engineers. Like, that's where the vast majority of the quality information and conclusions have been arrived at, because Kodak was the dominant force in that space for decade after decade after decade, and they spent a lot of their money on researching these things. So like, I have such affection for the conclusions they've reached and for the palette that a film print or a film negative to film print system will create. But there's a lot of limitations built into that. We talked about grain already quite a bit today. Grain's not inherently a desirable thing. Like, it can have a place aesthetically, but grain is noise. Grain is an absence of information, so that's not a desirable thing. The dynamic range of a film negative, or the color gamut, how broad a spectrum of color can it capture? There's some hard limitations built into that actual medium that are not like engineered, they're just built in, and we can actually beat things like that today. We have sensors that have cleaner noise patterns. We have sensors that can capture more dynamic range or a wider color volume. So we want to be able to take advantage of that, especially as we're moving into a world where we don't deliver everything for SDR or 48-nit theatrical. We want to take advantage of the extra dynamic range and color volume, and anytime we profile and use a profile from a traditional film system, we are not only profiling and availing ourselves of those desirable characteristics, but also of the limitations of that system. All the limitations that I just talked about. Grain notwithstanding, because we're not typically we can't model grain with something like a LUT, which is the most common form of a profile that we will get. But like any legacy film print profile, like this, the Resolve Film Looks LUTs that are living inside of Resolve here, if I apply this LUT, and it's not going to be perfect because it actually expects a slightly different color space than I'm currently feeding it. But if I apply this LUT, I might get good results. I might like what I see. But in order to make this work in a color managed environment, in an environment where I want to be able to target HDR displays and not just SDR displays, I have to do some serious bending and contorting and stretching and reimagining of the numbers inside of this LUT in order to make that work. Because what this LUT is a profile of is a system that takes a high dynamic range Cineon film negative and prints it out to a very, very low dynamic range SDR display referred color space. So to make that work in a modern day color managed environment, which as you guys know is my jam, like the color management and good image science, good engineering, that's the way to fly. That's the way we preserve our creative intent and ensure that it is reproduced across a variety of media and in a variety of viewing conditions. It's really, really tough to make those things play nice with each other. It can be done. I've spent too many years of my life figuring out ways to do it. But in terms of personal favorites, I've arrived at a place, specifically in the last like 6 to 8 months, where I just am done. Like I don't want to do that anymore. I want to design print stocks that are inspired by and take the best of the conclusions of that photochemical tradition and of all those smart color scientists at Kodak, but which are not hamstrung by the limitations of a traditional film print system or the profile that we would create from it, that I then have to come up with creative workarounds for. So that's really like the genesis, to make a quick plug. That's the whole idea behind the new generation of colloid tools that I have here. You'll notice I've got no more film prints here. This is where there used to be film prints, and now I'm done with film prints. Now we are very, very acutely modeling the things I find pleasing about my favorite film prints. Like roughly these are based on a 2383, a 2393, and a 3510, a Kodak, and a Fuji. But they're based on the things that I like about those print stocks without inheriting the limited dynamic range and the the display referred output and the, like all of and the limited gamut, like all these things that kind of come with them. It's an attempt at getting what's good and leaving the rest. So I would say my favorites right now, you're looking at them right here, 1, 2, and 3. I've graded like my last 30 jobs just using one of these print stocks and then tailoring things upstream as needed. But I've really tried to wean myself off of traditional film profiles.
All right. EC Zonka asks, what do you rather use, remote grades or local grades? And what do you recommend?
I like remote grades, especially like I use them a ton for commercials. Like if I'm doing a 60 and a 30 cut down and then a couple of 15s and it's all the same assets across there. There's, until we're at the very, very end, I really want the adjustments and revisions that are being made. I just want those things to ripple out across so that I don't have to be a good bookkeeper and make sure like, oh, when we, trimmed the contrast back by 5%. Did that make its way onto all the other places that shot lives? I'd rather those things happen automatically in a remote grade, which for anyone who's not familiar, all we're talking about right now is that if I have timeline 1 here and I create a second timeline by like duplicating timeline 1 and it shares some of the same assets. So if I go to timeline 1, copy here, and then I forget actually where I've got I think I am on locals right now. So if I switch over and say use remote grades, once I grade this here, let me just do any old thing at all so that we've got something that we're working with. Let's see here. There you are. I want this to go on the clip level, not on the timeline level, like so, and then I'm gonna get that working right. So if I do like, I'm just doing a kind of stock grade here on Isabella, for example. If I do this, and then I, make this little adjustment down here, and then I go back over to timeline 1, where I was a moment ago, and I also flip myself to remote grades here. Now this is going to receive the same adjustment that it did in the other timeline. And if I update it here, it will update in timeline 1 copy, so on and so forth. So that's what we're talking about. I like that because I generally don't want grades to differ. I don't want to give 2 versions of the same shot a different grade until the very end. Then when we get to the very end, depending on where in the edit this shot is placed versus where in the other edit the shot is placed, there may be contextual or flow considerations to be made of like, well, in the flow, in the 2 shots that this shot is sandwiched in between in timeline 1, the needs are slightly different. So now I need the ability to do individualized treatments. at which point I will often copy my remote grades to my local. And now I have local grades, and if I decide that for contextual reasons, I want to do just an extra pinch of gain on this shot, I will not see that updated over on timeline 1, where it's going to stay where it was before. And I also, back over here on timeline 1, instead of what I just did, which was copying the remote grades to the local, I could also just on an individual shot basis, like save a still of this version, right click and go to version 1 under my locals and say load, and then paste that version, and I would get the same net result. I can now tweak this, and if I go back to timeline 1, I won't see that tweak having happened, but everything else will still be connected. It's just a single instance. If I really only want to pull one shot off at one shot in one timeline kind of out of the pile, that's a good way to do it, is to right click on that specific shot and say version 1 load. And that way you're only using that one shot in a localized, tweaked format.
All right, we got 2 questions from Jim Robinson. These are kind of philosophical. Do you see film grain being something that will be a thing of the past with so many people streaming these days? Walter Volpato mentioned that he thinks film grain will be deprecated. And do you find that we are not in tune with new generations of end viewers that don't have the same love for cinema film looks? It feels like we are musicians that are pushing jazz sometimes.
Yeah, all really good questions that Jim is asking that I often ask as well. So it's, are we, what is going to be the role of like the characteristics that we associate with like desirable cinematic color? How is that going to change for, like my kids or, younger generations? It's going to shift in some direction. And to be honest, I don't know what the answer is to all that. I tend to agree with Walter's take that like the film grain thing is going to kind of be deprecated. I'll also say that I just had a colorist who I really admire yesterday share with me that they feel there is a tactile or a visceral, I should say, engagement that comes from specifically more static shots in a movie where it's like maybe you're lingering in a non-moving camera angle on a character having a quiet moment and they're not doing very much. This person really felt like grain creates a sort of visceral like thing to look at, a little dancing something to see that's not just completely devoid of energy, which I thought was an interesting argument. Hadn't heard it before, and it kind of like got me thinking in a different way. But in general, I agree with Walter's take that noise and like limitations of a system, sooner or later, rather than being a kind of convenient way to like, and in my opinion, sort of a cheap way, when it's used a lot of the time to like cue to people, hey, you're in a movie, like you're really gonna like what you're seeing type of thing. I think we're gonna come up with more and more sophisticated ways of doing that as time moves forward. And I would cite as one of many examples, like look at what Roger Deakins is doing in partnership with his colorists and color science teams who've supported him. Roger Deakins is, an OG like film cinematographer, and his films still have an incredibly polished palette and a very like almost everything about them is still borrowing from the film tradition, but there's no grain in those images. There's no halation in those images. There's no gate weave in those images. All these things that we tend to like sort of like reach for as go-tos of like, oh, this is going to help me sell a film thing. I do think, and I guess I kind of hope that we're going to leave those things behind and start to see them for what they are, which is like aberrations and like problems in the system as opposed to innately desirable traits, and move beyond them into cueing, like into creating aesthetically like magnetic images that use different characteristics to sort of engage and draw the viewer in. Sooner or later, like to answer it even broadly, I talked earlier about like, man, we've got big shoes to fill with like the decades of awesome research by brilliant people that Kodak funded. But sooner or later, we're going to have to get in there and stand on those people's shoulders and move past what they did. It's not going to last forever, like they gave us a good head start for almost a century, but sooner or later, we're going to have to continue moving the needle forward. And that only happens if we stop thinking about emulation and start thinking about evolution and what we can do. Now that we do have really good models, how can we push those further? And did we answer all that? That was kind of rambly.
Yeah, I think it was all the question actually.
Cool.
So next one comes from Ritu Joshi. How to know the rate of error in an average slider? For example, the contrast slider in DaVinci Resolve with respect to photometric interpretation?
Oh, that's a cool question. Let's see. So I'm going to read that. The rate of error. I'm not exactly sure I know what that means in this context. I feel like I have a sense of what's being asked, which is like what sort of scaling should I use for the various knobs in Resolve in order to like align with the photometric counterpart for them. If I hope I'm understanding that somewhat correctly. So I would say this, it depends on which knobs you're using. Like there are some knobs that have no photometric counterpart. Like contrast is actually a good example. There's no such thing. Contrast isn't a knob out in the real world. Contrast is like that's contrast in the real world. That's less contrast. That's more contrast. There's no such thing as a knob that I can turn out here in the real world. It's ratios. It's where is the light coming from, how much of it versus what are the secondary sources, and how do they relate to that primary source. So some things we can't exactly relate in a photometric sense. So I tend to think about things on the photometric front. It's all going to be variations on stops and degrees of color temperature. Those are really the two that I go back to. Whether that's, okay, this shot needs to come down, whatever, like a third of a stop. Or it's something like, let's switch to a new image just for the heck of it. It could be something like, we need to bring down this practical source within the frame by a half of a stop. So it's all kind of going to be the same to me. Is like, I still want to think about that in terms of like, oh, so we want to knock down that lamp? How far? Like about a stop. That's still can be useful whether or not we're doing it at the global level. But for me, everything is going to come back to degrees of color, degrees of Kelvin, I should say, and to exposure. And those are just going to, I like to use tools that will give it to me in that metric, which is why I made my exposure tool and why I use the temperature knob for color temperature adjustment, which seems pretty close to like a 1-to-1, like 1 unit of temp is 1 degree of Kelvin type of thing. So I tend to rely on those things and then go with a full heart into like, all right, contrast, that's just feel. Like there's no objective analog for that out in the real world, so I'm not going to look for one, and I'm just going to go by feel. So I hope I interpreted that question correctly. It definitely piqued my interest, but I'm not 100% sure. The rate of error thing I wasn't positive on, but we can touch on it again if I didn't. Let's see how we're doing on time here, guys. Yeah, let's see if we can get maybe 2 or 3 more before we wrap it up today.
Okay, let's go to a fast one from ADOC. What's the best rule of thumb to apply when making a soft contrast look? Maybe some tips and tricks.
Yeah. So what's the best? Sorry, some of these for some reason they don't quite make sense to me. It's easier for me when I read them. Read it to me. Oh, the best rule of thumb. Okay, to apply when making a soft contrast look. Yeah, really good question. So I'll touch briefly on this. I think there's a really good primer on it in the ditch the video look video that I did. But I would say in general, it's this, is that like we want to, like, let's do a soft contrast thing. Let's say we want to go like really soft on something like this. So I'm just going to do my output and then we'll do our own contrast curve underneath it. So the first thing to understand about doing a soft or a lower contrast thing that we got to understand is like we need contrast. Like we can't do, the eye needs contrast in order to like engage with an image. So it's not a question of no, but of subduing, no contrast, but rather of subduing our contrast. So what I would say, like the rule of thumb for me, is just to do lots and lots of roll and lots of compression, so that even if I'm setting my kind of like overall goalposts, again, I talk about this in that Ditch the Video look video, but even if I'm reducing my overall goalposts like really aggressively, something like this, the trick to making that work is going to be to do a roll on both sides, so that within the sort of effective dynamic range that I'm creating for this image, I am still getting tonal separation, and it doesn't feel like someone forgot to grade the shot, if that makes sense. So like I would characterize this as a quite like low, soft kind of contrast image, but it's still got contour because I did this nonlinear S-curvy thing. And then the last thing I would say is, when you are reducing contrast, by default, what you're going to get is, let's go back over here to Isabella. Actually, no, this shot's fine. By default, when you are reducing contrast, let's do this underneath the print so it's a little easier to see. As you reduce contrast, you're also losing saturation. Does everyone see that? Like if I pop my scopes out to where you can look at them, like the actual vector scope signal is getting, oh, it's still not quite. Oh, no, it is. Okay. The actual vector scope signal is getting smaller, right, as I reduce this. So that's a big thing. There's lots of different ways to negotiate this. This is something else that I designed my colloid contrast tool to help me deal with better. But one good thing to pay attention to is, like, as you are reducing contrast, you are going to lose saturation. And so in general, you're going to want to, there's kind of a inverse relationship there. Like, as contrast goes away, you're often going to want to get color back in order to keep the eye engaged. So if you wanted to do it in the way I did for many years, it might just be as simple as like, all right, well, I pulled some contrast back, so I'm going to try to pump my saturation such that the kind of mass of my vector scope isn't shrinking with that contrast reduction. And that goes a long way to making an image not just feel like flat and like, again, someone forgot to finish grading it type of thing. So that would be another good tip to use, is like, regardless of the mechanism, anytime you're doing contrast in a negative direction, anytime you're taking it away, think about and pay attention to what's happening to your color, and think about whether or not you might need to counter a negative contrast with some positive saturation or colorfulness in order to keep some life in your image.
All right, another question from Yen Chen Gun. I'm curious about some of the resources you would recommend to read and look to find out more about image science and colors beyond DaVinci Resolve.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I typically will give this prescription for that. The best place to start with getting a more thorough grasp of image science, if you're really feeling like you want to dive into it, first of all, accept up front, it's a massive field of study that you could spend the rest of your life trying to get to the bottom of, and you never will. It's a very, very complex subject. But if you want to get started, the first thing that we can do, if you're coming from to the subject the way most of us are, which is as an artist, as a colorist, the best thing that you can do, like the entry point that we all have into image science, the place where we touch image science with the most regularity as colorists in 2021, is with color management. That's, that is all image science. It's all driven by image science, and we all have to deal with it in some form. It's just a question of how skillfully or poorly we are using color management. So I always encourage you guys, go deep just on color management. How does Resolve color management work? How does ACES work? How does Baselight's color management work? How does Aries color management pipeline work? How does Red IPP2 work? Compare them visually to one another. Start to try to gather information on how they're working under the hood. Go by Lattice. That would be another easy one, for the simple reason that it will allow you to do stuff like, okay, I want to see how Aries log C to 709 transform looks. I can actually pull it up in Lattice and see what that transform does. Lattice is just a really handy way of being able to get a bit better insight into something that we can audition visually on a particular image to see what its overall kind of processes are. So Start with color management. Just go really deep on like becoming a master of color management and of understanding, like just simply even within Resolve, like if you can get to where you understand every single one of these knobs and the effect they're going to have on your image and what's best for different projects, that's, I mean, for me anyway, that was plenty to bite off for a while. So just work on understanding that stuff, understanding tone curves, gamuts, the way we move in between those things, the math that goes into them, 3x3 matrices, all that fun stuff. You can learn all of that just by studying color management and using it as your sort of compass or your anchor to dive into image science. Like ACES Central is a great resource for this. I can recommend, I'll leave you guys a couple links. Another one that comes to mind is Nick Shaw's Cinematic Color website, where he talks about these things at great length. That's some great stuff to initially dive into. And then if you really want to get into it, there's books out there that are super dense. There's the Reproduction of Color and Color Appearance Models are the two kind of like go-to Bibles that are both probably around 1,000 pages of really dense reading, that if you want to go truly deep on color science, those are a good place to start. But I would just start with color management and with exploring it. And I'm actually going to pull that link up for you guys right now. Yeah, here it is right here. I'm going to put this, oh wait, we're not on Zoom, so I can't put it in the chat. I'm going to leave a comment on my YouTube after we wrap up today with a couple links that are a good place to continue your studies into image science. And let's do one more if we got one, Ruff.
Okay, let me pick one then.
Heavy lies the crown. I hope everybody's paying off Raphael on the side to get your questions answered. This guy holds a lot of power, man.
All right, maybe this one from EUDoc. How to create a soft, soothing halation without being too aggressive? And I want to add to this question, and where to put that halation, before or after the grain?
Yeah, good question. So I've covered halation somewhat before, and I think I actually walked through my scheme. So I'll try to dig that up, but you guys can go back through prior episodes of grade school to talk about it or to look at it. I'm basically using layer mixers in the add mode combined with a blur specifically in the red channel is kind of the basic recipe there. And I go through it very in great detail in a prior episode. In terms of placement, upstream of grain for sure, because we want that to be a part of what's happening underneath the grain structure as opposed to something that is, because if you think about what we're doing with halation where we're blurring things, all of a sudden that texture that should feel uniform and should feel, to use a fancy word, like the substrate or the underlying essence or like individual like building blocks of that image, if that uniform substrate gets interrupted by blurring in particular areas of the image, I find that to be jarring. So I would always do my halation. You guys won't see into the stack here because it's a compound node, but if I drop my halation on, and we won't even see it happen, and it won't do anything on this image. We could do it over here, and let's turn off this decon thing. So maybe this airy one is a good one. Yeah. So you guys can see it kind of happening like in these highlights up here, like here on this edge is a good place. And I think that this looks much better. Oh wait, I don't even have my grain on here quite yet. Let's add that on. Where am I grain? I don't know if I have grain in this project yet. I don't even, let's do simple grain. That's my stack that requires a external asset that I don't want to bring in right now. So if we just do simple, really simple grain like we talked about before, and pump it up so it's nice and easy to see, I think that this looks much better than that. So here's our prior version, and here's this one. It's actually kind of tough to spot even in this one. Very tricky. But I would say just in terms of workflow procedure, it works better, more consistently, upstream of the grain rather than downstream. And Raf, am I correct in seeing that we still have like a lot of questions that we didn't get to, or are we catching up?
We're catching up, actually.
Okay, good deal. Well, that's a good place to call it for today then. Thank you guys very much for coming out for grade school. This has been fun. These last couple, we've been going more freestyle. I'm going to try to come up with a theme for next Friday. I feel like these have better replay value when we have a theme to them. So you guys can all feel free to chew on, like, what do you think would be an interesting thing for us to focus on for an hour when we get together next? And leave a comment. Like I said, I'm going to leave a couple of color science resources for you guys in the community forum or the community page on the YouTube. And you can comment on there or anywhere else that feels convenient on what you might want to talk about next week if you have any ideas. And we'll kind of come up with a theme and focus things up a little bit when we get there. And until then, always enjoy hanging out with you guys. Hope you go have some new fun, exciting adventures in color after this morning's conversation. And we'll see you next week.